The morning sun filtered through the city buildings as Dr. Eliza Washington guided her dark blue sedan into an open parking spot outside her favorite coffee shop. After 3 days of back-to-back presentations at the medical conference, all she wanted was a proper cup of coffee before heading home to shower and change. The conference had gone well. Her research on innovative surgical techniques for trauma patients had been well received, and several colleagues had approached her about collaboration opportunities. Eliza checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing a strand of hair that had escaped her neat bun, and grabbed her designer handbag from the passenger seat. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing as she stepped out of her car, dressed in a tailored navy suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. She had learned early in her career as one of the few black female neurosurgeons at City Memorial Hospital that appearance mattered, especially for someone who didn't fit the typical doctor stereotype many patients still held. She fed the parking meter, making sure to add extra time. The last thing she needed was to rush her coffee because of parking concerns. Eliza was about to head toward the cafe when she noticed a police cruiser pulling up behind her car. She paused, assuming the officer was simply parking, but felt a twinge of unease when he stepped out and walked directly toward her. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" the officer asked, his voice carrying an edge that immediately put Eliza on alert. "Yes, it is," she replied with a polite smile, though her heart rate had already begun to quicken. Years of experience had taught her that these encounters required a careful balance. Be respectful but confident, non-threatening but not submissive. Officer James Brendan was young, maybe early 30s, with close-cropped hair and a rigid posture that suggested someone deeply committed to authority. His own. His eyes scanned her, then the luxury car, then back to her face with a slightly narrowed gaze that made Eliza's stomach tighten. "You're parked illegally," he stated flatly. Eliza blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't understand. This is a legal spot and I've just paid the meter." She gestured toward the parking meter with its green display showing 45 minutes remaining. The officer's face hardened. "This area is restricted during morning hours. Can't you read the sign?" He pointed to a sign several spaces down that clearly applied to a loading zone, not the regular metered spot where Eliza had parked. "Officer, with all due respect, that sign is for the loading zone starting 3 spaces down. This is a standard metered spot." Eliza kept her voice steady, reasonable. She'd been coming to this coffee shop for years and knew the parking regulations well. "License and registration, please." Officer Brendan's tone had shifted from merely stern to something colder, dismissive, the kind of tone that suggested he'd already made up his mind about her. Eliza took a slow breath. "Of course." She opened her bag carefully and extracted her wallet, pulling out her driver's license. "My registration is in the glove compartment. Would you like me to get it?" Instead of answering, Officer Brendan snatched the license from her hand, studying it with obvious skepticism. "Dr. Washington, really?" The disbelief in his voice was unmistakable. "Yes, I'm a neurosurgeon at City Memorial." Eliza maintained her composure despite the familiar sting of having her professional identity questioned, something her white colleagues rarely experienced. The officer let out a small scoff. "Right, and I'm the Surgeon General." He glanced at her car again. "How exactly does someone like you afford a car like this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Someone like you." 3 simple words that carried the weight of centuries of prejudice. Eliza felt her professional calm beginning to crack, replaced by a growing indignation. "I earned it through 12 years of medical training and 7 years as an attending physician," she replied, her voice tight. "Officer, I've parked legally. I've paid the meter. Is there something else I can help you with?" By now, a few morning commuters had slowed their pace, watching the interaction with cautious interest. A barista from the coffee shop stood in the doorway, coffee pot in hand, her brow furrowed with concern. "Step away from the vehicle," Officer Brendan ordered suddenly. "Excuse me, I said step away from the vehicle. Now." His hand moved to rest on his belt near his holster, not drawing his weapon, but making its presence known. Eliza complied, moving slowly. "Officer, may I ask why you're doing this?" "I've done nothing wrong." "Your attitude is problematic, ma'am, and I have reason to believe this vehicle may be involved in reported theft in the area. Theft? That's absurd. This is my car. I can prove it. Eliza reached toward her bag again. Don't move. The officer's voice rose sharply. Hands where I can see them! The small crowd of onlookers had grown. A middle-aged woman had her phone out, clearly recording. A businessman in a suit had stopped entirely, coffee forgotten in his hand. Officer, please. This is a misunderstanding. Eliza tried once more, her professional experience in high-pressure situations helping her maintain some level of calm, despite the adrenaline now flooding her system. Officer Brendan stepped closer, invading her personal space. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle. This is unnecessary, and Eliza began. She never finished her sentence. Officer Brendan grabbed her arm, spinning her around with unnecessary force and shoving her against the side of her own car. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs and sent a sharp pain through her shoulder. Stop resisting, he growled, though Eliza had done nothing of the sort. I'm not resisting, she managed to say, her cheek pressed against the cool metal of her car roof. Please, you're hurting me. The officer ignored her, roughly pulling her arms behind her back. When Eliza instinctively tried to straighten her posture to relieve the pain in her shoulder, Officer Brendan's response was immediate and shocking. His boot connected with the back of her knee, causing her leg to buckle. Eliza fell hard onto the pavement, unable to catch herself with her arms restrained. Pain shot through her knee and hip as she landed, her expensive suit scraping against the rough concrete. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. The woman recording moved closer, her phone still raised. That's not right, she called out. She wasn't doing anything. Lying on the ground, Eliza felt a storm of emotions. Humiliation, rage, fear, and beneath it all, a profound weariness. This was far from her first experience with prejudice, but never had it been so public, so physical, so blatant. Her medical credentials, her expensive clothes, her luxury car, none of it had protected her from being seen first and foremost as a black woman who didn't belong. Officer, she said through gritted teeth, tasting blood where she'd accidentally bitten her lip during the fall. My name is Dr. Eliza Washington. I am a neurosurgeon. This is my car. I have parked legally. You have no right to treat me this way. Officer Brendan loomed over her, his face a mask of authority unchecked. You should have complied immediately. Now you're facing charges for resisting an officer. I did comply. There are witnesses. Eliza looked around at the growing crowd, some looking concerned, others outright angry on her behalf. At least 5 people had phones out now recording the incident. A young man stepped forward tentatively. Officer, she really didn't do anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. She was being perfectly reasonable. Officer Brendan turned his cold gaze on the bystander. Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you. I think it concerns all of us, came another voice from the crowd, an elderly woman with a shopping bag. I've been coming to this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. As Eliza struggled to sit up on the pavement, she caught sight of her reflection in her car's polished door, her hair now disheveled, a smear of dirt on her cheek. Her dignity stripped away in broad daylight over nothing more than parking her own car while black. In that moment, she realized that the next few minutes would define not just this encounter, but how she would choose to respond to injustice in a system that had just shown its true face. Little did she know that among the crowd gathering around her, someone was about to step forward who would change everything about this situation, someone neither she nor Officer Brendan could have possibly expected. The world seemed to slow down as Eliza sat on the cold pavement, her tailored suit now stained with dirt and her dignity in tatters. A dull ache throbbed in her knee where Officer Brendan had kicked her, but the physical pain paled compared to the humiliation burning through her chest. 20 years of education, countless nights without sleep during residency, and a reputation built through dedication and excellence. None of it had protected her from being thrown to the ground like a criminal. Stay down, Officer Brendan barked, though Eliza had made no attempt to stand. His hand remained unnervingly close to his weapon as he spoke into the radio on his shoulder. Dispatch, I've got a suspect detained for a parking violation and resisting an officer. Resisting. The word hung in the air like poison. Eliza had done nothing of the sort, and the growing crowd of onlookers knew it. That's not what happened, called a young woman in scrubs, probably on her way to a hospital shift. She was just standing there talking to you. Officer Brendan ignored the comment, his jaw tightening as he noticed more phones pointed in his direction. The morning sun glinted off their screens, silent witnesses that couldn't be intimidated. "Ma'am, do you need medical attention?" asked an older gentleman who had stepped closer, his kind eyes meeting Eliza's. Before she could answer, Officer Brendan moved between them. "Sir, step back. This is police business." The man didn't move. "I'm a retired paramedic. This woman is injured and sitting on dirty pavement. At minimum, she needs to sit somewhere clean while you sort this out." Eliza used the momentary distraction to carefully shift her weight, wincing as pain shot through her knee. Her hands trembled slightly, the body's natural response to adrenaline, but her mind was rapidly clearing. Years of handling medical emergencies had trained her to think clearly under pressure. She needed to de-escalate this situation before it got worse. "Officer," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I've parked legally, paid the meter, and was simply going for coffee before heading to the hospital for my shift. I'd be happy to move my car if there's an issue with where I've parked." Officer Brendan looked down at her with barely concealed contempt. "A bit late for cooperation now, isn't it? You should have thought of that before resisting." A middle-aged woman pushed through the growing crowd, her business attire suggesting she was headed to an office nearby. "I have the whole thing on video," she announced, holding up her phone. "She never resisted. You pushed her against the car and kicked her legs out from under her." Officer Brendan's face flushed. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to delete that recording. It's illegal to interfere with police business." "That's not true," came another voice from the crowd. "Citizens have the right to record police in public spaces. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court." The crowd was growing larger and more vocal. What had started as a few concerned onlookers had swelled to nearly 20 people, their collective presence forming a protective circle around Eliza. She could feel the shift in energy, the initial shock giving way to outrage. "Everyone needs to disperse," Officer Brendan commanded, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "This wasn't going according to plan. This area needs to be cleared." No one moved. Instead, the barista from the coffee shop approached with a cup of water and a clean towel. She knelt beside Eliza, ignoring Officer Brendan's glare. "Here," she said softly. "For your lip. It's bleeding." Eliza hadn't even noticed. She accepted the towel gratefully, dabbing at her split lip. "Thank you." The simple act of kindness nearly broke her composure. She'd spent so many years being strong, the only black woman in her medical school class, one of few female neurosurgeons at a prestigious hospital. That vulnerability felt foreign, dangerous even. But sitting on the ground, her professional armor stripped away, Eliza felt exposed in a way that terrified her. "Officer," she tried again, "my hospital ID is in my bag. I'm the head of neurosurgery at City Memorial. I have patients scheduled this afternoon. Please allow me to show you my identification properly." Officer Brendan hesitated, clearly calculating his options as more people gathered. His radio crackled, another officer asking if he needed backup. "Negative," he replied after a moment. Situation under control, but it wasn't under control. The crowd had taken on a life of its own, phones recording, voices rising in protest. Someone had started a live stream. A nearby shop owner had emerged with security camera footage offered as evidence. "You can't just assault people for parking," shouted someone from the back of the crowd. "This is why we need police accountability. I'm calling the chief of police right now." Officer Brendan's face had lost its confidence, replaced by a dawning realization that he might have seriously overstepped. Still, pride kept him from backing down completely. "I was following protocol for a suspected stolen vehicle," he insisted, though more to himself than anyone else. The statement hung in the air, its implication crystal clear to everyone present. Why had he suspected this particular car was stolen? What about Dr. Eliza Washington had made him jump to that conclusion? With as much dignity as she could muster, Eliza rose to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her knee. Standing at her full height, which, though not particularly tall, carried a natural authority born from years in operating rooms, she looked Officer Brendan directly in the eyes. "Why did you suspect my vehicle was stolen, Officer Brendan?" she asked, her voice carrying across the now hushed crowd. She had noticed his name badge earlier, but hadn't used it. A small reclamation of power. He blinked, caught off guard by her directness and the use of his name. "We had reports of luxury vehicles being stolen in the area. And you assumed I stole this one because... Eliza left the question hanging, forcing him to fill in the blank. Officer Brendan's eyes darted around, suddenly aware of the dozens of witnesses waiting for his answer. It matched a description, he mumbled unconvincingly. No, it didn't, called out a voice from the crowd. I work at the precinct. There haven't been any reports of stolen blue sedans this week. Eliza recognized the speaker, a young desk officer she'd treated for migraines last month. The connection was small but significant. In that moment, Eliza realized she wasn't just fighting for herself but for every person who'd ever been profiled, harassed, or made to feel less than human because of how they looked. I'd like to file a complaint, Eliza stated clearly, pulling herself to her full height despite the pain in her knee. And I'd like my license back, please. Officer Brendan hesitated, then reluctantly handed back her driver's license. His hand was less steady than before. I still need to write you a citation for the parking violation. There is no parking violation, insisted the coffee shop owner, who had joined the crowd. She's in a legal spot and I'll testify to that if needed. Officer Brendan's radio crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end was asking for a status update, mentioning something about reports coming in about an incident, presumably from the live streams and calls flooding the department. As he turned slightly to respond to his radio, Eliza caught sight of an elderly man making his way slowly through the crowd, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. There was something deliberate about his movement, a sense of purpose that made people naturally part to let him through. Despite his age, he had to be in his 70s at least. He carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. What struck Eliza most was the look on his face, not just anger or concern, but a deep, personal disappointment that seemed to intensify as his eyes locked onto Officer Brendan. The elderly man stopped at the edge of the small clearing that had formed around Eliza and the officer. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the crowd seemed to sense something significant was about to happen. Officer Brendan, still speaking into his radio, hadn't noticed the newcomer yet. When he finally turned back around, the citation book in his hand, his eyes landed on the elderly man. The change in his expression was immediate and profound. Shock, followed by something Eliza hadn't seen from him yet. Fear. The pen in Officer Brendan's hand froze mid-air. "Dad?" he whispered, the single word barely audible yet somehow echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the scene. The single word, "Dad," seemed to hang in the air between Officer Brendan and the elderly man who stood firmly despite his cane. The crowd fell silent, every person sensing they were witnessing something significant. Eliza looked between the two men, noticing for the first time the resemblance in their eyes, though everything else about them suggested two entirely different worlds. "James," the older man acknowledged, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades. "I came for my morning coffee and found this instead." He gestured toward Eliza, still disheveled from being thrown to the ground, and then to the crowd with their recording phones. "Would you care to explain yourself?" Officer Brendan swallowed hard, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. "Sir, I was responding to a potential—" "I was sitting by the window," the older man cut him off, pointing toward the coffee shop. "I saw everything. Every single thing." Each word landed like a stone. "So I'll ask again. Explain yourself." Eliza watched the transformation in Officer Brendan's demeanor with a mix of surprise and grim satisfaction. The man who had kicked her to the ground moments ago now looked like a scolded child, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "There have been reports of stolen vehicles in the area," Officer Brendan began weakly. "No, there haven't," interrupted the young desk officer from the crowd. "I already told everyone that's not true." The elderly man shook his head slowly, disappointment etched in every line of his face. "This isn't what I taught you, James." He turned to address the onlookers. "For those who don't know me, I'm Judge Robert Brendan of the Circuit Court." He nodded toward Officer Brendan. "And yes, this officer is my son." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Brendan was apparently well known to many present, judging by the looks of recognition. The judge turned to Eliza, who was still standing despite the pain in her knee. "Ma'am, I cannot begin to apologize enough for what happened here today." "May I ask your name?" "Dr. Eliza Washington," she replied, straightening her posture despite the dirt on her once immaculate suit. "I'm the head of neurosurgery at City Memorial." Judge Brendan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Dr. Washington? I believe you performed surgery on my colleague, Judge Wilson, last year. Spinal tumor, if I recall." Eliza nodded, surprised at the connection. "Yes, that's right." "He speaks very highly of you," the judge said. "Said you saved not just his life, but his quality of life." He shot a pointed look at his son, the implication clear. "This was the woman you assaulted." Officer Brendan's face had drained of color. The realization that he had manhandled a prominent surgeon known personally to his father's colleagues seemed to finally penetrate his consciousness. The judge turned back to Eliza. "Dr. Washington, do you need medical attention? I saw what happened to your knee." Before she could answer, a police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but siren mercifully silent. A middle-aged officer with captain's bars stepped out, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. "Judge Brendan," he acknowledged with clear respect. "We've been getting calls about an incident here. Care to fill me in?" Judge Brendan didn't mince words. "Captain Rivera, my son assaulted this doctor over a parking space that wasn't even illegally occupied. Threw her to the ground. Kicked her. The whole thing's on about 20 cameras." He gestured to the crowd, many still holding up their phones. Captain Rivera's expression hardened as he surveyed the scene. "Officer Brendan, step away and wait by my vehicle." For a moment, Officer Brendan looked like he might protest, but a stern look from both his father and the captain silenced him. He walked stiffly toward the cruiser, the swagger in his step long gone. The captain approached Eliza. "Dr. Washington, I'm Captain Rivera. I'm deeply sorry for what happened here today. We'll need your statement, but first let's get you some proper medical attention." "I'm fine," Eliza started to say, her professional instinct to minimize her own discomfort kicking in. "You're not fine," Judge Brendan interrupted gently. "You're bleeding, your knee is swelling, and you're in shock whether you recognize it or not." He offered his free hand, the other still gripping his cane. "Please allow me to help you to that bench over there at least." There was something about the judge's manner, respectful but insistent, that broke through Eliza's resistance. She accepted his hand, wincing as she put weight on her injured knee. As they moved slowly toward a nearby bench, the crowd parted, some offering words of support. The coffee shop owner approached with a fresh cup. "Your usual Dr. Washington," she said. "On the house, of course." The small gesture of normalcy, being recognized as a regular customer, not as a victim, nearly brought tears to Eliza's eyes. She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. Once seated, Judge Brendan lowered himself carefully beside her, his joints protesting audibly. "I've spent 40 years on the bench fighting for civil rights," he said quietly, his eyes on his son, now speaking with Captain Rivera by the police cruiser. "Started as a young lawyer during the movement. Worked my way up. Thought I'd help change things." He shook his head. "And then I see my own son doing this." Eliza sipped her coffee, allowing the warm liquid to soothe her throat. "You can't control his actions." "No," the judge agreed, "but I can make damn sure there are consequences." He looked directly at Eliza. "I hope you'll press charges. I'll testify to what I saw myself." The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on Eliza. The father of the officer who had assaulted her was now offering to testify against his own son. The world wasn't as simple as she sometimes wished it could be. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do that? He's your son." Judge Brendan's face showed a complex mixture of pain and resolve. "Because justice matters more than protecting my son from his own wrong actions. Because I've seen too many officers like him protected by a system that values brotherhood over accountability. Because—" He paused, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Because I failed him somewhere along the way. And this is the result." Across the street, Officer Brendan was handing over his badge and gun to Captain Rivera, standard procedure when an officer was being investigated. His shoulders were slumped, the authority he had wielded so carelessly now stripped away, at least temporarily. "He'll fight the charges," Eliza observed. "He'll claim he was following procedure." Judge Brendan nodded grimly. "Yes, he will. And he'll have the police union behind him, but he won't have me." He gestured toward the crowd, many of whom were sharing their video evidence with Captain Rivera. "And he won't have them either. Times are changing, however slowly." A young paramedic approached, medical bag in hand. "Dr. Washington? Captain Rivera asked me to check you out." As the paramedic knelt to examine her knee, Eliza found herself watching Judge Brendan. The elderly man was observing his son with an expression that spoke volumes about complicated love. The kind that demands better, that refuses to enable harm, that chooses hard truth over comfortable loyalty. "You know," Eliza said to him, "most parents would defend their children no matter what." The judge met her eyes. "That's not love, Dr. Washington. That's cowardice dressed up as family loyalty." He glanced again at his son. "Real love is holding those we care about to the highest standard, not the lowest." Captain Rivera approached, notebook in hand. "Dr. Washington, when you're ready, I'd like to take your statement." "Judge Brendan will need yours as well." The judge nodded. "Of course." As the paramedic wrapped her knee, Eliza realized that the morning had taken a turn none of them could have anticipated. What had begun as a simple coffee stop had evolved into something that would likely change lives. Hers, Officer Brendan's, and perhaps even Judge Brendan's. The older man's unexpected intervention had thrown everything into a new light. "You know what the hardest part is?" Judge Brendan said suddenly, his eyes still on his son. "Recognizing that this isn't just about one bad officer. It's about a system that allowed him to believe he could act this way without consequences. A system I've been part of for decades." He turned to Eliza. "I hope you'll allow me to make this right, not just for you, but for everyone who didn't have 20 witnesses and a judge sitting in a coffee shop window when it happened to them." For the first time since the ordeal began, Eliza felt a glimmer of hope, not just for justice in her case, but for something larger. The unexpected ally sitting beside her represented something powerful, the recognition that true change required people to stand up, even when it was their own family in the wrong. "I think," she said carefully, "that this might be the beginning of something important." Judge Brendan nodded, the weight of the moment reflected in his tired eyes. "It always starts with one moment, one choice. The question is whether we have the courage to see it through." 3 days after the incident, Eliza sat in her office at City Memorial Hospital, staring at her computer screen. The video had amassed over 2 million views. What had happened to her outside that coffee shop was now being discussed on national news programs, debated in online forums, and analyzed by legal experts across the country. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists seeking interviews, advocacy groups offering support, and colleagues expressing outrage. She scrolled through the comments section against her better judgment. Most were supportive, expressing anger at Officer Brendan and the system that enabled him, but others were predictably cruel, questioning her version of events despite the clear video evidence, suggesting she must have done something to provoke the officer, or claiming the entire incident was being blown out of proportion. A knock at her door pulled her attention away from the screen. Her assistant peeked in. "Dr. Washington, your next patient is ready." And Judge Brendan called again. "He says it's important." Eliza nodded, closing the browser window with relief. "Tell him I'll call back this evening." Since the incident, Judge Robert Brendan had called several times. He'd been true to his word at the scene, giving a detailed statement to Captain Rivera that corroborated Eliza's account and the video evidence. His public condemnation of his son's actions had made headlines, adding another layer to a story already capturing national attention. But his most recent calls had been about something else entirely, a request that Eliza wasn't sure she was ready to grant. He wanted her to meet with his son. The rest of Eliza's workday passed in a blur of patient consultations, surgical reviews, and administrative duties. Her colleagues had been supportive, creating a protective buffer between her and the outside world's curiosity. Still, she could feel the weight of attention wherever she went in the hospital. Nurses and orderlies who had seen her on the news, patients who recognized her face, even the custodial staff who offered quiet words of support as she passed. By evening, her knee still ached despite the brace she wore beneath her scrubs. The physical reminder of what had happened made it impossible to compartmentalize completely, to lose herself in the work that had always been her refuge. Sitting in her car in the hospital parking garage, Eliza finally returned Judge Brendan's call. "Dr. Washington," he answered immediately. "Thank you for calling back." "Judge Brendan," she acknowledged, fatigue evident in her voice. "You said it was important." There was a pause on the line. It is. I've spoken with my son. He's agreed to meet with you as I suggested. No lawyers, no union representatives. Just the three of us. Eliza closed her eyes, feeling the tension headache that had been threatening all day finally bloom behind her temples. With all due respect, Judge, why would I want to do that? The department is conducting an investigation. I've filed my complaint. My lawyer is handling the civil suit. I understand your reluctance, the judge replied, and you have every right to proceed through official channels alone. But I believe something important could come from a direct conversation, something that statistics and policy changes can't accomplish. And what's that? Eliza asked, skepticism heavy in her tone. Understanding, he said simply, not excuses or justification for what James did. There are none. But a chance to confront the mindset that led to it, to make him see you as a human being, not just a case number or a viral video or a lawsuit. Eliza laughed without humor. That's exactly the problem, Judge. He should have seen me as a human being from the start. That's not my responsibility to fix. No, Judge Brendan agreed quietly. It's not your responsibility. It's a favor I'm asking and one you have every right to refuse. He paused. James is on administrative leave. The investigation is ongoing. But regardless of the outcome, unless something changes in how he sees the world, he'll either return to the force with the same biases or carry them into whatever he does next. The car felt suddenly too small, too confined. Eliza rolled down the window, letting in the cool evening air. Why are you pushing for this? He's your son, but you've been surprisingly willing to hold him accountable. Why not just let the system handle it? There was a long silence before Judge Brendan answered. Because I failed him, Dr. Washington. I thought raising him with general principles about equality would be enough. I thought my work on the bench spoke for itself. But somewhere along the way I missed the signs that he was developing these attitudes, and now a good woman has been harmed because of it. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with regret and responsibility. Eliza could hear the pain in his voice, not just for her but for his son, for the relationship that had been irrevocably changed. When and where? She asked finally. Tomorrow evening, if possible. My chambers at the courthouse. Private, secure, neutral ground. Eliza agreed and ended the call, wondering if she was making a mistake. The next evening found her climbing the courthouse steps, ignoring the small group of reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the meeting. Inside, a security guard led her to Judge Brendan's chambers, a wood-paneled room lined with law books and framed photographs documenting a long career in justice. The judge rose to greet her, shaking her hand formally. Officer James Brendan sat stiffly in a chair by the window out of uniform, looking smaller somehow without his badge and authority. Thank you for coming, Dr. Washington, Judge Brendan said, gesturing to a comfortable chair opposite his son. I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation. Eliza nodded, taking the seat without acknowledging Officer Brendan directly. Up close, she could see the family resemblance more clearly. The same jawline, the same shape of eyes, though the son's were harder, defensive where the father's were reflective. I'm not sure what you expect to come from this, she said honestly. Just truth, the judge replied, taking his own seat, uncomfortable as it may be. He looked pointedly at his son. James has something to say to begin. Officer Brendan cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Eliza's shoulder. I'd like to apologize for my conduct during our encounter. The words were stiff, formal, clearly rehearsed. Eliza felt a flash of anger. Is that what we're calling it? An encounter? Not an assault? Not a violation of the oath you took to protect and serve? His eyes flickered to hers, then away. The department has procedures. The department doesn't have procedures for kicking someone to the ground over a legal parking spot, Eliza interrupted, her voice level but intense. So let's not hide behind procedure. Let's talk about why you really stopped me, why you assumed my car was stolen, why you escalated a non-situation into violence. Officer Brendan's jaw tightened. I was doing my job. No, you weren't, his father interjected firmly. Your job is to serve and protect everyone equally. To use appropriate force only when necessary. To de-escalate situations, not create them. He leaned forward, his gaze steady on his son. This is your opportunity to be honest, James. With Dr. Washington, with me, and with yourself. Something flickered across the younger Brendan's face, anger, shame, defiance, all mixed together in a toxic brew. What do you want me to say? That I stopped her because she's black? That I wouldn't have questioned a white woman in the same car. Would you have? Eliza asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. For the first time, Officer Brendan looked directly at Eliza, really seeing her. I don't know, he admitted finally, the words seeming to surprise even him. Maybe not. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the defensive wall. A small acknowledgement of the truth they all knew. That day, when you approached my car, Eliza said carefully, you didn't see a doctor, a neurosurgeon who saves lives. A woman who worked hard for everything she has. You saw a threat. A problem. Someone who didn't belong. I want to understand why. For the next hour, a painful conversation unfolded. Officer Brendan spoke haltingly about his years on the force, the attitudes he'd absorbed from certain colleagues, the way fear and suspicion had gradually colored his worldview until he saw danger in ordinary situations, especially when those situations involved people who didn't look like him. I'm not making excuses, he said at one point. And for the first time, Eliza believed him. But we're trained to look for threats, to trust our instincts. Over time, you start seeing patterns that might not be real. Those aren't instincts, Eliza replied. They're biases, and they have real consequences for people like me, who can't take off our skin at the end of a shift. Judge Brendan listened mostly in silence, his face growing more troubled as his son spoke. Occasionally, he asked a clarifying question or redirected the conversation when tensions rose. But mostly, he let them talk. Two people from different worlds, trying to understand the gulf between them. As the meeting drew to a close, Eliza felt emotionally drained but oddly unburdened. Nothing had been resolved in any practical sense. The investigation continued, her lawsuit remained active, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. A door had been opened that couldn't easily be closed again. This is just the beginning of a much longer conversation, Judge Brendan said as he walked Eliza to the door, not just for James, but for the department, for the city. Eliza nodded, thinking of the thousands who had marched in support of her, of the police reform advocates who had reached out, of the other victims who had begun sharing their own stories in the wake of her viral video. Change never comes easily, she said. But sometimes it starts with one painful moment of honesty. As she left the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps. Reporters called out questions that she ignored. Her knee still ached, a physical reminder of trauma that wouldn't quickly fade. But alongside the pain was something else, a sense that what had happened to her, horrible as it was, might become part of something meaningful, something lasting. The path forward wouldn't be simple or straight. But for the first time since Officer Brendan had approached her car that morning, Eliza felt like she was walking it on her own terms. 3 months had passed since that morning outside the coffee shop. Autumn had given way to winter, and a light dusting of snow covered the city streets. Eliza pulled her coat tighter as she climbed the steps of City Hall, nodding to the security guard who recognized her immediately. These days, most people did. She found her way to the meeting room where the newly formed Police Accountability Commission was gathering. The space was already half filled with community members, police representatives, and city officials. In the front row, Judge Robert Brendan sat reviewing his notes, his cane propped against the chair beside him. He looked up as she entered, offering a respectful nod. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated. Not quite friendship, but a partnership formed through shared purpose. After that first difficult meeting in his chambers, they had spoken regularly, their conversations expanding from the personal to the systemic issues that had enabled what happened to her. Eliza took her seat at the commission table. As a key community representative, her voice had become central to the reform efforts now underway. The journey to this point had not been easy. The police department had initially tried to minimize the incident, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding in their first press statement. But the combination of clear video evidence, Judge Brendan's testimony, and the public outcry had made that position untenable. The internal affairs investigation had concluded 6 weeks ago. Officer James Brendan had been removed from street duty and reassigned to the records department, not fired despite Eliza's lawsuit and formal complaint. The police union had fought hard to protect him, as Judge Brendan had predicted. Still, it was more accountability than most officers faced in similar situations. The meeting began with the police chief presenting updated statistics on officer complaints and use of force incidents, broken down by race and neighborhood. It was data that hadn't been publicly available before Eliza's case brought scrutiny to the department. As you can see, the chief concluded, we're implementing the new de-escalation protocols and seeing promising early results. Officer-involved incidents are down 18% compared to this time last year. And what about the demographic disparities? Eliza asked, pointing to the charts displayed on the screen. Black residents are still disproportionately targeted according to your own data. The chief nodded uncomfortably. Yes, that remains a challenge we're addressing through the new training program. Which brings us to the next agenda item. He turned to the door. Officer Brendan, you're up. Eliza felt her heart rate quicken as James Brendan entered the room. It was the first time she had seen him in person since their meeting in the judge's chambers. He looked different, thinner, more subdued, the swagger gone from his walk. The confident officer who had thrown her to the ground was nowhere to be seen in the man who now approached the podium. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady but quieter than she remembered. For those who don't know me, I'm Officer James Brendan. 3 months ago, I assaulted Dr. Eliza Washington during what should have been a routine interaction. There was no justification for my actions that day. A murmur ran through the room. It was the most direct admission of wrongdoing he had made publicly. Since then, I've been working with the department's new training division to develop a program based on my failures. He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. We've created a case study using the video footage and my own testimony about the biases and assumptions that led to my actions. Every officer in the department will go through this training, with a focus on recognizing and correcting implicit bias in the field. Eliza watched him carefully. His words seemed genuine, lacking the defensive tone that had characterized their early interactions. Whether this change was born from true reflection or simply career preservation remained unclear, but the impact of his testimony would be real regardless. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Officer Brendan continued, briefly meeting Eliza's gaze before looking away. I'm here because what happened that day revealed problems that go beyond one officer or one incident. And addressing those problems starts with honesty about what went wrong. When he finished his presentation, the commission members asked pointed questions about the training program, its implementation, and how its effectiveness would be measured. Throughout the exchange, Eliza remained silent, observing the man who had changed the course of her life with one impulsive, bias-driven act. After the meeting, as people gathered in small groups to discuss the proposals, Judge Brendan approached her. What did you think? He asked without preamble. Eliza considered the question carefully. I think he's saying the right things. Whether he believes them, she shrugged. That's harder to know, the judge nodded thoughtfully. He's changed. How deeply, I can't say for certain, but he's not the same man who kicked you to the ground 3 months ago. Neither am I the same woman who was kicked, Eliza replied. It was true. The incident had transformed her in ways both painful and powerful. The physical injuries had healed. Her knee no longer ached except in cold weather, but the emotional impact lingered. She startled more easily. She felt a flash of anxiety whenever she saw a police cruiser in her rearview mirror. Simple activities like going for coffee had become complicated by memories and hypervigilance. Yet alongside the trauma had come purpose. Eliza had always been focused on her career, on being the best surgeon she could be. Now her vision had expanded. She still performed surgeries and taught residents, but she had also become an advocate, using her position and the platform that circumstance had given her to push for changes that might prevent what happened to her from happening to others. The community forum is next week, Judge Brendan said, interrupting her thoughts. They've asked if you would speak. James will be there too. Eliza had been avoiding public speaking engagements, preferring to work behind the scenes with the commission. The idea of standing before a crowd, recounting her experience yet again, made her stomach tighten. But she recognized the value of putting a human face, her face, to the issues they were addressing. I'll think about it, she said finally. Later that evening, Eliza sat in her living room, a glass of wine in hand, considering the judge's request. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Saw you on the news again. You doing okay? The simple question brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Was she okay? The answer wasn't straightforward. She was healing but changed. Stronger in some ways, more vulnerable in others. The incident had stripped away certain illusions that her education, career, and status would protect her from the biases that shaped the world. That painful truth had been replaced by a clearer vision of what needed to change, not just for herself but for her community. A week later, Eliza stood at the podium in the community center, facing a room packed with residents, officers, city officials, and media. Judge Brendan sat in the front row, his steady presence a reminder of how unexpected allies could emerge from trauma. Officer James Brendan sat several rows back, no longer in uniform, listening as she began to speak. 3 months ago, I stopped for coffee on my way to work, she began, her voice clear and steady. What happened next revealed painful truths about our community, truths that many already knew from personal experience, but that others needed to see on video to believe. As she spoke, Eliza could see the impact of her words on the faces before her. Some nodded in recognition of experiences too familiar. Others looked uncomfortable, confronted with realities they had been privileged to ignore. Officer Brendan kept his eyes on her, neither avoiding her gaze nor challenging it, simply listening. The work we're doing with the commission is just a beginning, she continued. Policy changes and training programs are necessary but not sufficient. Real change happens in moments of choice. When an officer decides how to approach a civilian, when bystanders decide whether to intervene or look away, when communities decide whose safety matters. After she finished speaking, people lined up to share their own experiences. A young man described being pulled over 14 times in 2 years, without ever receiving a ticket. An elderly woman recounted her grandson's fear of playing in their front yard because of police harassment. A retired officer spoke about the culture that discouraged reporting misconduct. Officer Brendan listened to it all, occasionally taking notes. When the forum ended, he approached Eliza hesitantly. "Dr. Washington," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "thank you for speaking today. For what it's worth, I'm trying to do better." Eliza studied his face, looking for the arrogant officer who had deemed her suspicious simply for existing in the wrong skin. She saw instead a man struggling with the consequences of his actions and his beliefs, a struggle that might, if he persisted, lead to genuine change. "Keep trying," she said simply. "Not for me, for yourself and for the next person you encounter who doesn't look like you." As she left the community center, walking out into the winter sunshine, Eliza reflected on the unlikely path that had brought her here. 3 months ago, she had been thrown to the ground, her dignity violated, her safety threatened. Today she stood tall, not despite that experience, but partly because of it, because she had refused to let someone else's biases define her story. The path toward healing, both personal and communal, remained long and uncertain, but with each step forward, each difficult conversation, each policy changed, each mind opened. The destination came a little closer into view. A community where coffee stops didn't turn into confrontations, where justice didn't depend on having a judge as a witness, and where dignity was the right of everyone, not the privilege of a few.